Nobody in Almond County, California could figure out why 39-year-old Colton Reyes spent every evening that winter alone in his father's old workshop, carving and drilling small wooden blocks nobody had ordered, stacking them in rows along the workbench until the shelves ran out of room. Colton had lost his left arm below the elbow 3 years earlier, in an explosion during his final deployment overseas, and most of the county assumed the workshop hours were simply something to keep his hands busy through a long, quiet winter. They weren't wrong about the hands part. They were wrong about almost everything else. By February, Colton had built and drilled nearly 400 small wooden nesting blocks, each one bored through with dozens of precisely sized holes. Using a drill press he'd rigged with a custom clamp so he could operate it one-handed without a second person's help. He mounted the finished blocks along the fence lines of his family's 60-acre almond orchard, row after row of them, and told anyone who asked, which wasn't many, that he was building homes for bees. Not hives. Homes. Almond County had seen plenty of odd projects over the years, but a one-armed veteran hand-carving what looked, to most passing drivers, like several hundred birdhouses nobody had asked for, that was something people talked about at the co-op through the whole month of February. By March, when the almond bloom failed to set properly on farm after farm across the valley, Colton's boxes stopped looking odd to anyone at all. If stories about resilience, quiet resourcefulness, and the wisdom hiding in unexpected places matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Colton's. Now let's find out what those wooden boxes were really for, and why an entire valley would end up needing them. Almond County sits in California's Central Valley, flat, fertile ground given almost entirely over to almond orchards that stretch for miles in every direction. Their white and pale pink blossoms turning the whole region into something close to snowfall for 2 or 3 weeks each February. The Reyes family had farmed 60 acres there since Colton's grandfather planted the first trees in the 1960s, and the operation had passed down, generation to generation, on the same rhythm every almond farmer in the valley depended on: bloom, pollination, set, and the long wait for harvest. Colton had grown up on that ground, left for the military at 19, and spent most of his 20s and early 30s deployed overseas in stretches that grew longer and further apart from home with each passing year. The explosion that took his left arm happened during his final deployment, 11 months before he came home for good. He spent the better part of a year in physical therapy and recovery before making the decision, quietly and without much fanfare, to move back to the family orchard and take over day-to-day operations from his aging father, Ray Reyes, who was more than ready to hand over the harder physical work. The adjustment was not easy, though Colton rarely discussed the specifics with anyone outside his immediate family. Simple tasks that had taken no thought before his injury now required entirely new methods, new tools, new patience. He relearned how to prune, how to drive equipment, how to manage the endless small mechanical tasks of running an orchard, one careful adaptation at a time. What he found, somewhere in that slow process of rebuilding competence, was that the deliberate, repetitive focus of working with his hands, even one hand and a fitted prosthetic he mostly avoided using for fine work, gave him something the rest of his recovery hadn't quite offered: a sense of steady, forward motion. The bee-box idea started almost by accident, the way Ray told it afterward, in a conversation with a woman named Dr. Elaine Kessler, a retired agricultural entomologist who'd spent 3 decades studying pollinator health for the state before retiring to a small property 2 farms over. Colton had met her at a county field day the previous autumn, mostly out of politeness, and had asked her, almost as an afterthought, why almond growers depended so heavily on trucked-in honeybee hives every February when the state was full of native bee species that had pollinated wild plants for thousands of years before commercial beekeeping ever existed. Dr. Kessler didn't have a simple answer, but she had a long one, and Colton listened to all of it. Commercial almond pollination in California depended almost entirely on migratory honeybee colonies, rented by the hive and trucked in from across the country every bloom season, an industry-wide practice that had grown increasingly precarious as honeybee colony losses climbed year after year from disease, pesticide exposure, and the sheer stress of cross-country transport. Native bees, by contrast, particularly a species called the blue orchard mason bee, were solitary rather than colonial, didn't require trucking, didn't sting aggressively, and were, pollen for pollen, often more efficient at almond pollination than honeybees. visiting more flowers per minute in the cool early spring temperatures when honeybees tended to stay clustered in their hives. The problem, Dr. Kessler explained, was habitat. Mason bees didn't live in hives. They nested in narrow natural cavities, hollow stems, beetle holes in dead wood, cracks in bark, all the kinds of small imperfect spaces that modern, tidy commercial orchards had systematically removed over decades of clean cultivation. Without nesting habitat, native mason bee populations in heavily farmed valleys like Almond County had collapsed almost as thoroughly as the honeybee colonies everyone worried about publicly. Commercial nesting blocks existed, she told him, pre-commercially drilled wooden boxes with holes sized to the exact diameter mason bees preferred, but most growers considered them a supplemental novelty rather than a serious pollination strategy, since a single wooden block housed only a fraction of the bee population a rented honeybee colony could provide. Colton asked how many blocks it would take to make a real difference across 60 acres. Dr. Kessler admitted she didn't know for certain, not at that scale, not with any published data she could point him to. Most growers simply hadn't tried it seriously enough to find out. That was, as far as Ray Reyes could tell, the exact moment his son decided to spend the winter finding out himself. Colton started in December, working through the coldest, quietest months of the year when there was little else demanding attention in the dormant orchard. He bought rough-cut lumber in bulk, built a jig that let him hold each block steady with his prosthetic while he ran the drill press with his remaining hand, and worked out, through weeks of trial and frustrating error, exactly how deep and how precisely spaced the holes needed to be to match the specifications Dr. Kessler had given him. His first 50 blocks were, by his own later admission, badly inconsistent, holes too shallow or splintered at the entrance in ways that would discourage nesting females. He scrapped most of that first batch and started over, refining his technique block by block until the work became almost meditative, steady, and repetitive in a way that had become, over that long winter, something closer to therapy than chore. His father watched the stacks grow along the workshop wall with a mixture of pride and mild concern. "You planning on selling these? Or just running out of shelf space?" Ray asked him once, not unkindly. Colton said he wasn't sure yet, only that he wanted enough of them mounted before bloom to actually test whether it made a difference. The neighbors were less patient than Ray. Hollis Weatherby, who farmed 400 acres of almonds adjoining the Reyes property and had rented commercial honeybee hives every February for 30 years without ever considering an alternative, drove past the fence line in January and saw the first rows of mounted boxes going up. He mentioned it at the co-op that same week, describing it, according to more than one account, as the Reyes boy building a few hundred birdhouses nobody asked for. The comment traveled the way comments do in farming communities that size, repeated with a chuckle at the feed store, at church, in the parking lot outside the county extension office, always with the same gentle, slightly worried undertone people use for something they don't quite understand but don't want to say anything unkind about directly. Colton kept building anyway. By the time bloom approached in mid-February, he'd mounted 380 finished nesting blocks along the fence lines and interior rows of the orchard, oriented, per Dr. Kessler's advice, to catch morning sun and stay sheltered from the valley's prevailing afternoon wind. He stocked a portion of the blocks with mason bee cocoons purchased from a small native bee supplier Dr. Kessler had connected him with, releasing them just as the first blossoms began opening, and left the rest of the blocks empty, hoping wild mason bees already present in the county's remaining hedgerows might find them on their own. What happened next across Almond County had nothing to do with Colton's orchard at first. In the second week of February, a commercial beekeeping outfit trucking several thousand rented hives up the valley reported catastrophic colony losses. Nearly 40% of their bees dead or too weak to forage upon arrival. A combination the outfit's own apiarist attributed to a harsh trucking route, unusually cold overnight temperatures during transport, and a lingering mite infestation that had gone undetected before the hives left their winter holding yard. It was not an isolated incident that year. Similar reports came in from two other commercial beekeeping operations serving different sections of the valley, part of a broader pattern of honeybee colony losses that had been building for years and simply arrived, that particular February, at the worst possible moment. Hollis Weatherby's 400 acres, entirely dependent on rented hives that arrived weak and undersupplied, saw almond bloom come and go with pollination rates well below normal. So did three other large operations across the county that relied on the same commercial beekeeping outfit. Growers watched blossoms open, flutter, and drop largely unvisited, the difference between a healthy nut set and a thin, disappointing one settling in almost silently over the course of 10 critical days. On the Reyes orchard, the bloom told a different story. Colton's mason bees, cold-hardy and active at temperatures that kept honeybees clustered defensively in their weakened hives, worked the blossom steadily through cool February mornings that would have shut down honeybee foraging entirely. Ray walked the rows with his son at the peak of bloom and noted, the way a lifetime almond farmer notices these things instinctively, that the trees looked heavier with pollinated blossom than he remembered seeing in years, dense with the kind of even, thorough set that meant a strong harvest was already taking shape. Hollis Weatherby came by in March, once the difference between the two properties had become impossible to ignore from the county road alone. He stood at the fence line for a long while, looking at the Reyes orchard's dense, healthy nuts set against his own thinner, patchier trees, and finally asked Colton directly what he'd done differently. Colton walked him through it, the same explanation Dr. Kessler had given him months earlier: mason bee biology, nesting habitat loss, cold weather foraging advantages, the whole slow chain of reasoning that had led him to spend a winter drilling holes in wood. By the following autumn, Hollis had ordered his own set of nesting blocks and asked Colton, somewhat sheepishly, if he'd help install them before the next bloom season. The county extension office, hearing about the season's outcome through Dr. Kessler's own professional network, invited Colton to speak at a regional pollinator health workshop that winter, where he stood at a podium with his prosthetic resting lightly on the lectern and explained, plainly, exactly how many blocks it had taken and exactly what it had cost him in December evenings to find out. Colton never made much of what happened that February. When people asked how he'd known it would work, he usually gave some version of the same simple answer. He hadn't known, not with certainty. He'd only wanted something steady to build with his hands through a long winter, and it turned out that patience, applied carefully enough, had a way of paying an entire valley back when its usual systems finally failed. There's a particular kind of resilience that comes from having to rebuild competence from nothing more than once, and Colton Reyes had already done that rebuilding once with his own body before he ever thought to do it for an orchard. He hadn't set out to solve a valley-wide pollination crisis. He'd set out to prove to himself, one carefully drilled hole at a time, that a single steady hand could still finish what it started, and in doing exactly that, quietly, all winter long, he built something that carried his family's harvest through a season that broke almost everyone else's.